All right, we're live, and today I'm with Nakia, and I'm really excited about talking about a uh, something that I think is taken for granted quite often when people think about facilitation, and is this idea of being neutral, and the importance of it, and maybe even some of the shadow sides of this concept of being neutral, which I think is really fascinating. Nakia, I'm so excited to have you with me today, and looking forward to chatting about neutrality.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thank you for the invite.
Yeah, and so when you mentioned, that you wanted to chat about this notion of being or the importance of being neutral as a facilitator, it immediately sprung to mind to me this like just the dichotomy of just holding both sides of that, right? And how it can be good and bad.
Yeah. So I think that when we talk about neutrality, like it's a thing that people seem to like aim for or assume that we have, and that it's always good to be in a meeting. Like you're facilitating, you're going to be the neutral person and like just hold the space for other people. But are never neutral. We always have biases and ideas of like not only the topic at hand, but like the way in which we should be engaging in these topics and like being able to talk to each other about it. And so when we go in assuming that we're neutral, I think that we do ourselves and the group a disservice.
Yeah, I think that was really interesting. When we were chatting just before going live here, and you're talking about the damage that can be done when you have have that assumption, or you're walking around with this kind of misbelief that you're neutral, just because as facilitators, we read and we learn about the importance of striving for that. But if we feel like we've gotten to that destination, it can do us disservice, right? Because we're not acknowledging this fact that there's thoughts and feelings that are there.
Yeah. And when we realize that we have these ideas and these thoughts and feelings, we can figure out how we want those to come into the room, right? And if we want them to come into the room and how we stop that, right? So like there are so many different facilitators that I know and love that I know that you also know and love. And their personalities help to hold the room. Like it feels different when I'm being facilitated by like Anna Jackson versus um, Keith or versus Fisher Qua, right? Like their personalities come into the room and they're dynamic in the space, like they're there, right? And so like this idea that like, oh, I'm just neutral and I don't do anything. That's not helpful. Like they bring their personalities into the space and then still are able to hold a container for people to engage in that way. But if you've got Anna and you've got Fisher and they're holding a space, like they're doing exactly the same facilitation, you're going to have different results just because their personalities come in and the way that they think comes into the space, and it alters the way that people engage in the material, right? And that can be really, really good. You can use it to your advantage. But when you think that you're like, oh, I'm just neutral, then and you can't see the ways that you are affecting the space, then you don't know how to be able to control for it. You don't
Mm,
know how it changes like the outcomes and the dynamics, or how to be able to like work with a partner to like lessen that. You know what I mean?
yes, absolutely. Wow, so many thoughts flowing. There's this last point you made. It's the dynamics of when you're co-facilitating. It's
Hmm.
like what's that dance like that's happening, or with these two personalities? Because now you've got this layering of two different, like, non-neutral parties, like having
Hey,
this combination of an impact.
yeah, yeah. And I usually do anti-racist facilitation, so I'm an anti-racist educator. And like there's so like the topic of racism is so fraught that people are really looking to the facilitator to like guide the discussion in like little nuanced ways that they're not when we're talking about like, oh, how are we going to do a strategic plan this year,
Sure,
right?
yeah.
And so like depending on your topic, it's even more important to realize like how you come into the room and the fact that you're not going to be neutral coming into the room, and to be able to like check yourselves when people who are in the room or participants are engaging with things in a way that you're like, oh, this feels some kind of way. Like, how are you responding to that verbally, non-verbally, and intentionally? And how can you like, again, how can you control for it? And being able to like see it is the first thing, right? Like doing that what, so what, now what, like getting that ladder of inference, just being able to like witness, and then you can figure out what you can do about it. But so many of us are out here not even seeing it or
Yeah,
knowing
yeah.
it.
And you bring up a really good point around, and it makes me think about the spectrum of facilitation because some facilitators, we look at the one side of things where we're looking at strategic planning or problem solving, or we're helping a group just get through a moment. And
Hmm.
they might have all the answers. They might be experts in everything they need to know, but we're just helping them get through that moment and do the group work necessary to move forward. But if they're wanting to learn about, you know, whatever, DEI topic, or biases that might be impacting them, or if there's some education aspect, if there's some sort of mindset shift or aha moment that has to be created, and they're asking for that, that's an entirely different thing, right? That's totally not neutral. You have
Yeah,
content they're asking for that you need to deliver and hand
yeah,
over and help them understand. And so I think it's also it's so nuanced, right? Because we have to think about what we've been asked to do while we're there, and how neutral. Where do we need to turn that neutrality dial?
yes, yes. And like I really appreciate you saying that, right? Because I often struggle in groups that I'm holding facilitation for, because like I get so excited about the content as well. And I one of the things I do very well is I point out patterns in the way that we're interacting or in the way that we're engaging with the material, right? And so how much of this do I need to like hold for other people, where I just like I keep all of my opinions out here, and like I don't inject those into the group, or I don't inject the patterns that I'm seeing, and how much is it that I am like telling them about the patterns that I'm seeing about how we engage, right? So that they're able to determine whether that's what they want to be doing or not. And so there's always this sort of spectrum of like, when I'm a facilitator, part of, especially if I use liberating structures so much, part of using liberating structures to me is for people to be able to like understand how they work while they're doing them, right?
Mm.
And so being able to point out the patterns of how we engage is part of that learning, and being like, do you want to show up? Like, these are tools that allow you to be able to show up in the way that you want to, but is that the thing that's most helpful at that point?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because often we'll talk about facilitation kind of being, instead of sage on the stage, or being a guide from the side, and but at the same time, you can't be a guide unless you have a compass. If you have some notion of directionally what's healthy, right?
Right.
And you're often, when the group is maybe going off into a tangent,
Hmm.
you have to make that decision of, is this a healthy tangent? Is this
Yeah.
on target? Is it helping us? Or is it not a healthy tangent? There's sometimes when we want to ask the group, hey, we're deviating. Is this where we want to go?
Hmm.
Sometimes we have to make the decision as a facilitator, like, I don't want to pose that question. I think the best thing is to get us back on track, because based on knowing this group,
Hmm.
posing that question is not going to get them where they want to go.
Yeah, yeah. I think that being able to be clear about our role is so important, and like whether whatever we decide, like it's so clear that like we are in a power position,
Mm,
right? And we are gatekeeping what that conversation is going to
yeah.
be. So again, kind of goes back to this idea of neutrality. Like we are not neutral. Like we control the conversation, right? We determine like what's going to be talked about and how we're going to talk about it. That's a huge power position, and it's critical that we know what our biases are, because otherwise they're going to come into the room regardless.
You
No.
know, another thing I've been thinking about, and want to just bring this up because it hasn't surfaced for me in a while, but when I first started the conference, Control the Room, which you're going to be speaking at, which I haven't mentioned yet, really excited about having you. So, um, and honestly, one of my favorite things about the conference and the facilitation community is getting to meet awesome facilitators like you, and just making friends and building the network. It's so lovely. And we met through recruiting speakers, and excited to see you here in Austin. And anyway, when I first started the conference, the Control the Room name was kind of a play on voltage control, and we're big fans of like saying, like, not necessarily that we're controlling, but that there's some control. And And to your point around creating containers, or just this notion that there is no true neutrality, right? Like we don't want to come in and steamroll things, but our influence, our presence is a form of control. Even if we're very loose with our control, the fact that we've come in and said, "Hey, let's do this method," or "I'm going to show you what like racism. I'm going to talk about what racism is," or
Yeah.
whatever your programming is, you're having some kind of control. But when I first started the conference, I got a lot of folks that were kind of in the very kind of art of gathering, the kind of emergent,
Mhm.
who really, really, really just like love the complexity aspect of things, which I'm a huge fan of complexity theory, but I know that like it doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? And so
Mhm, mhm.
I thought it was playful, this notion that like we're not talking about like turning all the screws and making everything so restricted, but it's at some point we're controlling stuff.
Mhm. It's good to hear the thought process on the background of the name, because I was definitely like, control the room, like the phrasing of it, like, because I'm a liberating structures kid, right? Like,
Yeah,
I am definitely part of the emergence idea, and so like that balance of like, how are we controlling it, and like, is that the goal to like control the room, and like how does your framework shift if you're like, I'm here to control versus like, I'm here to like cultivate the wisdom that is already there, right? But it's like, to your point, right? Like this idea of cultivating the wisdom and like bringing those gems from the people who are already there and having that emergence requires you to be able to control the process. So
that's right.
yeah, there's definitely a spectrum there that I think sometimes when we get in our ideals, and I live in my ideals, sometimes does get a little bit uncomfortable when you're like, oh, I don't want to do that. Like that
Yeah,
sounds like it's like heavy handed, but like also we're doing it in measured ways, right?
that's right. And sometimes it's called for, and sometimes it's not. I think that's the beauty of learning the rules so deeply and internalizing them to the point where you're willing to break them.
Yes, yes. And I will say that especially in anti-racism spaces, when you're trying to like set a foundation for people to be vulnerable about a topic that is very fraught for them, that has often been like a source of trauma for everyone in the room, regardless of race, right? Being able to like be very clear about like, this is what we're going to do and this is what we're not going to do, and if you stray over here, like, you are not going to be here, right? Like, you have to actually have a very, very strong container in order to protect that process, because otherwise people get hurt. So the very, very hard agree.
Yeah, yeah. The other thing that maybe we'll end on here that was coming up for me as we were chatting was this idea of naming the bias, or naming the lack of neutrality. If we have an opinion, if we have a realization, even just it's I don't know if it's always necessary. In fact, I can probably think of examples when I didn't want to do it or didn't feel comfortable doing it, but making that known to the group that I'm noticing this, I'm feeling this,
Yeah.
is perhaps, maybe the word is more authentic, so that
Mhm.
people realize that, oh, okay, they're acknowledging that they're thinking this, they're feeling this, and that's okay.
Yes, yes. So that's actually like a thing that we do in anti-racist organizing. We call it our boxes, and letting people know like where we are and what the lenses that we're coming into with,
Mm,
right? And it helps us be very clear about like what we're trying to do and what we're aspiring to. It also helps people understand like where we're coming from. And so like they know what they can ask us about and how they'll be able to get that. They can also tell us like when that lens is hindering us, when they're
mm.
like, oh, hey, like you're seeing it from this lens, and that's probably why you're not able to pick up on X, Y, and Z things. So absolutely agree. Plus, it brings in this idea of vulnerability. Like, we're all vulnerable on some level, and none of us are perfect, and nobody has a blank slate. And so I think it allows other people to not feel bad that they're not neutral.
Yeah, I think the other thing too, coming back to that point, because now hearing your thoughts, it reminded me of how when you do name it, when you do like surface it and make it known to the group, it's like you say, vulnerable, but also it's an opportunity to allow the group to know that this is not a steadfast position you're holding.
Yes.
Whereas if you don't name it, if you don't vocalize it, people are smart. They're
Mhm.
intuitive, and they can probably sense that you're favoring something, or your body language, your whatever, right? Your micro expressions, whatever it might be, telling them that, hey, he wants us to do. I might be telling them subconsciously that, hey, you should vote for this or whatever. If I name
Mhm.
it and I say, hey, I'm feeling this. What do y'all think? Then now it can be a conversation to unpack it, and the group comes to the conclusion, hey, they don't agree with me, and that's totally fine. But then that exposure, that conversation allows it to be public and be known, and people can wrangle with it.
Yes. The idea that once you name it, we can discuss it and we can talk
Yeah.
about it instead of when you don't name it, it's behind the scenes and it's pulling strings and like it's much harder to be able to um, engage with a lot of times. So yeah, 100%.
Wow, cool. Well, this has gotten. I love this. I love these conversations because it's so fun to get the juices going and and think about the importance of all the work that we do. And I appreciate you joining, and it's been fun getting to know you so far, and looking forward to having you in Austin.
Yeah, thanks again for the invite and I'm excited to be down there in a week.
Yeah, it's coming up. Awesome. Have a good day.